When we practice yoga, and I'm sure many of you do, we think of it as some kind of exercise routine or learning a few breathing techniques. But if you really think about it and ask yourself what is yoga, you'd find that yoga was one of the ancient India's schools of philosophy. And that just cannot be about a few postures and a few breathing techniques. It's much, much more than that. So, in today's podcast, I'm going to discuss this particular idea, that what is yoga and what is the underlying philosophy here. So, let's start. As I said, it is one of the ancient schools of philosophy. And if you are familiar with Indian schools of philosophy, there are generally two traditions. One are theistic traditions where there is belief in God, and there are non-theistic traditions such as Buddhism and Jainism where they don't discuss the idea of God. Which is why it surprises many people, particularly in the West, that how can there be a religion without a God? And that's very much a tradition here in India. So coming to yoga, in so many ways it's close to a non-theistic tradition called Samkhya Darshana, which is Samkhya philosophy. And yet it is slightly different from Samkhya. That is, it has this idea of God, the supreme eternal God, and Samkhya doesn't have. But the underlying epistemology or the metaphysics, they are very much same. And I'll give you a brief idea about that, what it is and how does yoga philosophy view this whole world. And first of all, I must point out that, like many other schools of philosophy of ancient India, yoga too has a particular ideal, which is moksha. If you notice this and compare it with other theological traditions, you'd find that in many other traditions the ideal is always God. But here, in Indian traditions, the ideal is not God. The ideal is moksha, that is, the end of suffering, some kind of enlightenment. And often God is some kind of a medium to achieve the end goal, which is the end of suffering. So God is not the end in itself, but a mean on that path. And as I said, the idea is always to end this suffering. And there are many ways to do that. Certain philosophical schools focus too much on meditation. Some don't take up this issue of yoga and meditation. They purely focus on devotion. There are different ways, but all of them have this single idea that we should be able to end the human suffering, and not just in this life, as they believe that there are multiple lives, but they want to end the human suffering in its entirety. That is, if you are reborn again and then again suffering, then also you should be able to work on that to end your suffering. But keeping that part aside, let's just focus on the very basics of the metaphysics of yoga. It's important because from here we derive the next few steps, that is the practical aspects of yoga, and you would see how they are rooted in the metaphysics. And for that we have to understand how yoga philosophy, much like Samkhya philosophy, views this universe. So it's a dualist philosophy, that is, the universe in its entirety is not just made of one thing, but rather two. So one is called Prakriti, which is very similar to nature or matter, but I'll tell you the difference in a bit. And the second is Purusha, which means some kind of spirit or consciousness. Now, let's talk about Prakriti or nature for a second. Yoga and Samkhya philosophy, they tell us that what we see around us, the material world, it comes from nature, it comes from Prakriti rather, and but it's not really Prakriti, it's a manifestation of Prakriti. So what does that mean? It means that if you look around and see different species and see different material objects, you see plants, you see rocks and mountains, then you'd find that eventually they have some kind of common cause and they are coming from same kind of atoms eventually. But that atom itself is also not the cause here. The cause is something else. And that cause has been described as Prakriti. But let me give you another interesting point from this philosophy. If you see Buddhism and Jainism, they believe in the causation principle. That is, there is a cause behind an effect, and cause precedes an effect. Yoga philosophy or Samkhya philosophy sees it as differently. It says that cause does not necessarily precede effect. And that may sound a bit bizarre to your common sense, but just hold on for a moment. Let me give you an example. Think of how you make curd from milk. That is, first you have milk and there is some kind of action on it, and with time it turns into curd. So clearly you can see the cause working in action. But this philosophy tells us that effect cannot just come up on its own because of the time or the action, but it was always there in the cause. Because if it wasn't there, how would it else come up? So the effect that there is curd, that quality was always there in the milk. And if it didn't have that quality, it won't turn into curd. If you think it another way, if it didn't have that quality, and if that quality of effect is not required, then you can make curd from anything else. But that's not possible. It's only possible in case of milk. So clearly there is this sense of effect which is not manifested yet in the cause itself. In other words, the cause always has the potential of an effect. And similarly, the Prakriti, it has the potential of creating this, all the universe that we see around us, all that we see, all the natural world, that is the manifestation of Prakriti, including you and I. We all are part of this natural world. And then the second thing, which means pure consciousness, that is Purusha, that is something beyond this universe that we see around us. So that is where this is dualist philosophy. And it tells us that when Purusha and Prakriti, they come in contact with each other, or they come in proximity, then there begins this phenomenon of natural world. The reason it's important to understand these philosophical ideas is that we also understand why we are doing yoga. We are doing yoga to eventually attain the pure consciousness that is Purusha, and that's how we end our suffering in this world and beyond. In fact, this is how the famous text of Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which is pretty much the foundational text and most important text of yoga, it begins. It says, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. That is, yoga is the inhibition of the modifications of the mind. That is, we work on all the different states of mind and consciousness and try to achieve that pure consciousness. And how do we achieve that? That's also given in the book. So let me briefly talk about this book, Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. The book is available with commentary, and I'm sure you'd find different commentaries, and it'll be available everywhere. One of the interesting ones I found was BKS Iyengar's commentary on Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. That is really interesting one. If you want to go for a more simple one, you may go for Sri Ravi Shankar's commentary on Yoga Sutras. And in fact, I have discussed that book in one of the earlier podcasts. So the book is divided into 4 segments or chapters known as Pada, and I'll briefly discuss one by one. First is Samadhi Pada, and as some of you would know, Samadhi is more like concentration, and the idea here is that you work on different states of mind, and you recognize that there are these variations due to different factors, and you find fluctuations in terms of your mood, in terms of emotions. So it's very much required, as it is required in any other practices in Indian philosophy, that you work on restraining or ending these fluctuations or patterns of consciousness. You calm your mind, you focus on something, and you yourself, being a witness of that, experience this process. The next segment is more interesting one and probably more popular because of the contents it contains. It's known as Sadhana Pada, and sadhana can be translated into let's say practice, or some kind of devoted practice where you're following certain discipline. And it is in this segment that you contain a lot of yoga techniques that you follow. So for example, there is Kriya Yoga and there is Ashtanga Yoga. And Ashtanga is literally translated into 8 limbs, and these 8 limbs will tell you different things. For example, the first is Yama, which talks about restraints or ethics of behavior. Second is Niyama, which is more about observances. Then come the Asana, and it is here that we focus most of the time, which is Asana means physical postures. And then second important thing is Pranayama, that is the control of the prana or breath, so breathing exercises. Then there is pratyahara, which is when you withdraw your senses. What does that mean? If you follow any meditation techniques, step by step, you work on withdrawing your senses. And you keep going deeper and deeper into your own consciousness. Then comes dharana, which means you are concentrating. And then comes dhyana, which means you're meditating. And then finally samadhi, which means complete absorption in it. So this segment will give you in-depth guide on how to do yoga. And the next two padas, Vibhuti Pada and Kevalya Pada, add more knowledge to the theory and practice that we have learned so far, and take it to the next level where we learn about how to achieve moksha and how to attain certain supranormal powers. It doesn't mean any kind of supernatural power, but mostly in sense of how do you live your life and practice yoga. So that's just the beginning of yoga. And as it is prescribed in most of these texts, you have to practice and understand simultaneously. In fact, this is how Indian philosophy functions. It goes along with these meditation and spiritual practices. It's not just intellect based, it's not just based on logic, because most of the times these philosophers have believed that our senses, even our understanding of reason and logic, can get affected because of how our senses function, how our mind and body function. So a lot of stress is given to our physical health as well as our mental health. And only when we are in good mental and physical health can we discuss more deeper philosophical ideas. So in Indian philosophy, these two things go in parallel. You study something, you practice it, and you do meditation on it, and then you take the next step. It's not that you keep sitting and intellectually keep discussing all the ideas. No, it doesn't happen. So I hope you'll practice and you'll learn a lot of things by reading yourself, by exploring yourself. And I hope this podcast has been of some value in that direction.